Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar at the Open Data Institute from a slightly sunny London today, although you can't see it because we're in an internal room. We're all here to talk about the future of data infrastructure, and we're going to be looking at the global view today, which is really exciting. So just a few housekeeping things at the start of the presentation. Please, if you're joining us today, then do introduce yourselves in the chat. Say where you're from, which country you're from. We're really interested to know where our members of community have joined us from today. I've got a few very brief housekeeping things to go through. So just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be shared via social media on our email newsletter, The Week in Data, which comes out every Friday. So we'll be sharing it there as well. And it's going to be archived on the ODI website and will be made available on YouTube. We might use quotes and extracts from the recording for future ODI communications, so do look out for that as well. And if you've got questions for our special guests today, then please do add those questions into the chat, and you can do that at any stage of the conversation, and we'll try and answer as many of those as possible. So I'd like now to introduce our amazing speaker today. I'm really pleased that we've actually finally managed to make this happen. We have a bit of a rock star in the GovTech world joining us, and that is Aaron Maniam. Aaron is a Fellow of Practice and the Director of Digital Transformation Education at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. Aaron co-chaired the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the future of technology policy, and he now chairs the GFC on GovTech and digital public infrastructure. And Aaron's also a member of the UK Department for Science, Innovation and Technology Advisory Panel on redesigning the digital centre of government. So brilliant to have you along today, Aaron, and thank you so much for giving your time today. And I'm Emma Thwaites. I'm one of the directors here at the Open Data Institute, and the session today is a conversation between the two of us and hearing all about Aaron and his work and his views on the shape of GovTech today. Hello, Aaron.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to be here. Yeah.
First of all, something that's been on our lips and in our minds for about a year now, nearly a year, is the concept of the National Data Library. And we've been holding quite a lot of webinars about this topic recently. So we're really interested to hear from you and your broad range of expertise from around the world and your research on what steps the government here in the UK needs to take to deliver the National Data Library, but also other major digital and data infrastructure projects.
Now, clearly, I'm a huge fan, as someone who works in an academic setting, of the National Data Library, right, and the affordances that it gives us to be able to have researchers use data and large-scale data sets in a much more systematic way. So I'm a huge fan of it. And I think what it really is emblematic of a much larger sort of approach that we can take to data. And I think there are kind of four key steps in this overall approach. The first is to remember that we need to see data not as a private good, as something that is depletable or that is easily used up, that is characterized by kind of the traditional economic notion of scarcity, but really as something that is generative. That if we use it well, it's something, where the more you use it, the more data there can be, and the higher quality of the data you'll actually get realized in the end. Now, this is really important, actually, because I think once we realize that we're moving beyond a traditional economic paradigm of scarcity and moving to one not just of abundance, right, but of generativity, where the more you use data, the more we play with it, the more insights, the more information, the more wisdom can come from it, the stronger then our use becomes. So I think for me, a fundamental philosophical position is that we start from a position of generativity. And of course, this is something that the ODI is no stranger to, right? You've been thinking about data as public infrastructure, data as something that has public good qualities for the longest time. And I think the idea of data as generative rather than data as scarce is something that is already very much there in the ethos of what the ODI does. Having said that, as a broad principle underpinning, what we then need, I think, is three specific approaches that any government would want to have. First is to have a very clear legislative framework, having a robust legal setting whereby data sharing access and safeguards are very clearly spelled out. This then, I think, gives the public the assurance that whatever use of the data that happens, whether by researchers or by others, it will always be within a very, very clear legislative set of guidelines and parameters. Second, I think it's important to invest boldly as much as we can. How do we need to figure out ways to fund infrastructure that is both secure as well as scalable? And this will include things like cloud storage of the data, APIs to ensure that the data usage can be interoperable across systems, and access controls, right, to make sure that we know exactly who is accessing data and when. And these sorts of infrastructures, I think, give a system the kind of confidence that people need in order for data to be used well. And then the third aspect, apart from legislation and investment, I think would be on collaborating as widely as possible, building partnerships across multiple sectors, the public sector, academia, of course, because that's what libraries are for, industry, civil society, all being able to come to the data and use it as well as they can. France does a pretty good job with this, right? With their health data hub. If you look at what they've managed to do with what they call non-nominative data in a secure setting, they've managed to create access to multiple data sets in a centralized way that supports research and policy, but backed by really strong legal and governance structures. And that I think is the kind of system of clear legislation, investment, and collaboration that we will want to have.
It is really interesting, I think, you said from the phrase you used from a philosophical point of view, to see data as a generative force. Do you think, because a lot of the metaphors that have been used about data in the past, so that this idea of data being the new oil, they sort of play on that notion of data being extractive in nature, and there's a lot of pressure to try to place a value on data, which one can understand because in the public sector, the Treasury has to see that there is a good return on investment for public funds. So I wonder how we square this sort of notion that actually the value of data is generative, but there are these pressures, these economic pressures to actually be proving some kind of value.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's a really important question, Emma. So I wrote a piece about this actually on the generative quality of data that I think the team can share in the chat. And if you think about it, we're no strangers to the fact that sometimes the value of something that we do, or either an activity or a product that we create, is either underestimated or overestimated by traditional economic metrics. We see that with things like externalities, we see that with things like merit goods and demerit goods. And in a sense, generativity is just, for me, it's a dynamic quality of positive externalities. The more you use something, the greater its use can become, the greater momentum and activity you get around it. And actually, that's an example of a set of positive externalities, but that apply across time in a very dynamic and self-generating way. It's not a one-off set of externalities that we sometimes see, right, in more traditional economics textbooks. So if you look at the examples that I draw there, and I talk about things like the tragedy of the commons occurring in a very physical sense in the analog age, but thinking about this in the digital age, the tragedy of the digital commons is actually underusage rather than overusage. And I think we need to think of things in those terms and use all the techniques that we've had in the past, right? Imputation of certain costs and benefits, and get a sense of the overall estimation of what the value might be, but recognizing that those estimations may well be undervaluations, given that generativity results in the kind of dynamic momentum I described.
It's really interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking there's a whole new set of skills attached to this, like a whole new set of skills around the economics of data and
Yeah.
how you measure digital assets, I guess, non-physical digital assets. So I wonder, like more broadly, this piece about skills, what are the skills you think are needed for good, strong data infrastructure, and how do we get them?
Yeah. And again, I'll answer this in two parts, a kind of more fundamental principle part and then a more tactical part about what we can do. On the fundamental principles, I think the most important thing is that we need a new language, right? Even before we get to skills, we need new vocabularies and new ways of understanding what exactly data is. And you used the phrase yourself, right, Emma? The idea of new metaphors for data. And I think that the metaphors we use need to fundamentally change. Metaphors that we need are metaphors nowadays of stewardship, of trusteeship, rather than of ownership in a very, very traditional, bound, private good set sort of way. And again, I remember thinking a lot about this idea of metaphor during the pandemic, right? When we were asking ourselves, what were the metaphors for the pandemic? And I gave a TED talk about this, asking us to think about the pandemic not as a war or not as a journey, but as something that is much more of a moral ecology that we're all involved in and invested in together. And in a sense, we could think of data as a moral ecology as well. And I know the team has just shared the link of that in the chat. The data as a moral ecology helps us to see that we are all invested in this process and that when we see ourselves as mutually connected, not in the same way as a predator and prey, which a traditional ecology would be, but in a moral way where we have mutual responsibilities to each other, then actually the use that each of us does of data can end up creating either positive or negative dynamics for others. And within that, then I think we need three particular sets of skills. One is what I would call data stewardship. So again, to go back to the idea of stewardship and trusteeship, knowing how to manage, classify, and protect data, especially because it can be sensitive to an individual, and knowing how to treat data as stewards rather than as owners, where we then have complete autonomy and control. Second, I think we need much more interdisciplinary thinking behind how we actually approach data. We need language and vocabularies here that bring together the vocabularies of law, of policy, of technology, of ethics, of intersectoral pluses and minuses and costs and benefits. We need all of those kinds of different ways of thinking because data is going to be utterly pervasive, right? It's not going to obey the simple silos that are out there in how our agencies might get organized. So data stewardship, interdisciplinary, or even if you like, multi and transdisciplinary thinking, and not just interdisciplinary. And then finally, a really strong sense of being able to do project delivery, right? And this includes things like agile management, being procurement savvy, understanding the leadership that's required in creating healthy data systems. Because ultimately, if we don't have strong delivery capacity for the various pieces of digital infrastructure that are out there, we may well end up with situations where we don't fully realize the benefits of these different data ecologies. A really good example of this is how Estonia has approached, their X-Road data sharing platform, right? The federated data architecture that allows for data to move across multiple government agencies and some key private sector agencies like banks and telcos as well. And what they did there was to really blend policy as well as engineering expertise in the creation of X-Road and now in how they redefine and update the legacy infrastructure.
I'm really interested in this idea about data ecology, and I'm particularly interested in it, and I think our audience will be as well, in the international context, because we tend in this country to be quite Western focused. That's where we sort of look for our examples and use cases. And but a data ecology, because data can flow across geographical boundaries, can be global, I guess, depending on the different
Absolutely.
structures that different countries have access to. So I wonder what we can learn from other countries and what we need to put in place to make sure that nobody is left behind or disadvantaged.
Absolutely. I think a lot of this begins with a kind of policy approach that attempts to balance multiple competing concerns rather than a policy approach that is too absolutist. So, what I mean by that is data can have many priorities associated with it. There's data security, right? The security of the data itself and of the systems that manage the data. There's privacy of the data and managing of the sensitivity aspects. And then there's the scope that data can bring for innovation and for growth. And I think really healthy systems find ways to triangulate between this trifecta, if you like, of different priorities: privacy, security, and innovation and growth. Now, how do we do that well, right? If you think about examples like the data protection laws in India or in my own country, Singapore, all of them have found ways to achieve that balance. And I think that for me is the most fundamental aspect of this. If we approach data and try and move more towards one end of the extremes here, we end up with fairly lopsided data policy. Whereas data that tries to constantly manage across these different competing concerns and have consent rules, for example, that allow for the protection of the privacy and security of individuals, but at the same time allow for legitimate use and deemed consent in certain instances by businesses in order for innovation and growth. That's when we get to really healthy systems. And when you have a system like that, usually that manifests itself in three particular ways. One is these are systems that will be able to start small and scale fast. They'll pilot with users very quickly and then roll out ideas nationally, but bearing in mind that the rollout will always balance between those three competing concerns that I mentioned. They will design themselves for interoperability as a second quality to ensure that different parts of a system talk to each other. So that, we've seen this with once only principles, right? Once we've keyed in information on one government website, it's kind of nice to not have to do that multiple times over and over again. I mean, how many times can you key in a postcode, right? And not get bored of it. So I think it's important to design for interoperability across systems. And then most fundamentally, I think it's important to build trust and not just build technology. Ultimately, transparency and citizen autonomy are going to matter. And if citizens are confident of the systems that they're dealing with, they're going to want to use the systems even more. And that means we're building trust, not just tech systems. Singapore is actually a pretty good example of this, right? There's the SingPass system, which allows each of us to use our unique IDs that key in information to what we call the MyInfo system. And that allows different verified data to be reused across different public services with quite clear consent mechanisms, right? Each time you want to allow that data to be accessed by a new agency, your consent will be requested using the app that we have on all our mobile phones that we call the SingPass app. And this allows for the fact that there can be a real balance between convenience on the one hand and genuine interoperability as well as security and safety.
Now, this is really interesting, this sort of notion of individuals
Mm.
having agency over their own data, being sort of active participants in these government infrastructure systems. And I just wonder, what is the learning there for the UK? Because obviously at the moment there's a lot of discussion about digital ID, about digital verification services. It's been announced that digital driving licenses are coming. But on the flip side of that, trust has been a huge issue here. And it is worldwide actually. Typically, citizens don't trust governments,
Yeah.
their data. They tend to trust technology companies much more than they trust governments with data. So I just wonder what's the interrelationship between governments and citizens here? How should citizens be involved in the decision making to ensure the success of these infrastructures, these systems?
Absolutely, and I think this for me boils down to two really important things. One is that the systems need to be user-centered in their design, in their fundamental design. If citizens feel that a system is purely technology push, right? It's someone coming out with some bright idea about new tech because they saw it on an advert somewhere, they saw it on YouTube, or they visit Silicon Valley and they found this idea kind of cool. That's not going to cut any ice, I think, with citizens. They want to know that their needs are being met, that their lives become better because we've used these different aspects of technology. So user-centered design, I think, has to be a really core aspect here. And that's not just about convenience, right? But it's about ensuring that the user centricity is there in the security and the safety aspects of the system as well. Because ultimately, if systems aren't safe and secure, they lose confidence very, very quickly. All you need is one, maybe two crises for the confidence in a system to really erode. So when you put that together, user centricity and safety of a system that lead to trust, those two both then need to be balanced by a third aspect, which is what I like to call digital inclusion, right? People need to know that fundamentally that we're designing for a whole range of different user experiences, that people with disabilities, that people with different kinds of performance needs, with different sorts of preferences, are all going to be able to use these kind of aspects of technology in the best possible way. And if we keep those things in mind, user centricity, inclusion, and the overall safety and confidence that people can have in a system, that I think is what ends up breeding the kind of trust and cementing it, right, in what people are able to do.
I mean, technology has a fundamental role to play here. I mean, I'm not a technologist. People will be quick to tell you. But one of the sort of categories or species of technology that we're really interested here in at the ODI in exploring are privacy enhancing technologies. So things like synthetic data, federated learning, so on and so forth. And actually, what some of these technologies enable us to do is to vest control over data with the citizen. So
Yeah.
completely, I mean, some people, purists, might say this is not a decentralized architecture because you're centering data with the citizen. But just for, in crude terms, actually decentralizing the whole system. So thinking about, citizens' data, whether it's to do with their driving credentials or their educational qualifications, actually vesting control of that data with the citizen so that they make decisions about who has access to that data and under what conditions. Um, People might know that here at the ODI, we are now the organisational steward of a protocol called Solid, which is an
Yeah.
open standard that enables that to happen through the vehicle of personal online data stores. And it's being trialed, more than trialed, actually rolled out at population scale in Flanders. It's also been used a little bit here in the NHS. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, and what you see as being the potential applications for that, and more broadly the role of privacy enhancing technologies in enabling these infrastructures to thrive.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up Solid, which I think is a great example, right? What you're doing there in Flanders is allowing citizens to manage who sees their government held data, right? So there's a huge amount, so much more autonomy and so much more sovereignty that an individual can exercise on their own terms, but in ways that allow for the generative use of that data, right? Where we're not limited by permission granting protocols in such ways that you end up not getting the generative qualities of the data being realized. And for me, again, this boils down to a few different really interesting implications of the privacy enhancing technologies or PETs. The first is that I think they can be quite game changing as far as trust is concerned, because PETs like Solid empower users with data control, right? And they allow the users to know that ultimately they exercise autonomy over their data. And that means that the trust building is inherent by design in that whole process. Right. So I think that can be quite game changing, because what we've done is we've able to say that we will create trust as a matter of design and as a matter of inherent structure, rather than as a kind of byproduct of the process, two or three and other consequences later on. We don't want to have that. I think so. This can be quite game changing and transformative. The second is, I think we're seeing a situation where the technology is basically an enabler rather than a blocker of innovation and growth. You go back to what I mentioned earlier, right? That trifecta of policy priorities around data, privacy, security, and growth and innovation. Here we're enabling the growth. We're not blocking it. We're not creating protocols that end up being crude or kind of lugubrious pieces of bureaucracy that don't allow for innovation. We're seeing these rules become enablers because it allows for the analysis of trends of multiple users, right, gathered and amalgamated across multiple settings while we protect identities. Now, that's really critical when you think about it, because what this allows us to do is to get the benefits of generative and combinatorial aspects of data without necessarily compromising people feeling identified or kind of losing the effects of anonymity. So I think the fact that we are enabling but protecting identities at the same time here, that becomes really critical.
Yeah, because
Lastly, yeah, sorry,
oh,
just a quick
sorry.
thought as well. I think it's also important to think of this as a prototype, if you like, of future-ready governance, right? Because we're adopting open standards, we're allowing for auditability and accountability, we're incorporating ethics and, like I said, protection of identities by design. And these are not easy things to bring together, right? They can often be seen as deeply competing principles. But the fact that we're bringing them together in a relatively open platform tells us that this is what future-ready governance, right? This is what government as a platform, what governance as an open system with the right security protocols can actually look like. It's not easy to do, but I think the fact that it has been done as a prototype in Solid gives us hope for the fact that we might be able to scale it further.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that people fear, I don't think it's unique to the UK. I think it's felt in other countries as well. But there's a real fear here around surveillance. People,
Hmm.
worry about being surveilled. I mean, the reality, I guess, is that we kind of all are to a certain extent because there are cameras everywhere.
Yep.
Um, but I just wonder if you see those privacy enhancing technologies or PETs or PETs as being, part of the action of giving people reassurance that they're not being spied upon.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing to remember about any technology is any technology worth using is also going to be, it will have potential for misuse. right? If we didn't have the scope for surveillance or surveillance, right? Valence by other people, not just by some top-down entity. If we weren't seeing those possibilities, then this wouldn't be a technology that was worth using because it would probably be really clumsy and a little bit uncomfortable and cumbersome to use. But the fact that it is worth using and it results in these convenience enhancing dimensions and consequences helps us to then realize that, well, it could also then be misused. So the answer to this shouldn't be to use it less. The answer needs to be to put in the right standards and protocols and rules and norms as well that allow for the use of these technologies to happen with relative amounts of comfort, right? With an assurance that by design, this is not going to lend itself easily to the misuse and abuses that are out there. So I think this is exactly the right approach, right? To assume that we bake in the design of the technology to include these different aspects of assurance, while at the same time ensuring that the right uses can also be made.
That's really interesting. And actually, you've kind of slightly touched on my next question. Before I get to it, though, I did
Mm.
just want to remind members of our audience that fascinating conversation, and in each answer, so many additional aspects to explore. So please, people, don't be afraid to put your questions for Aaron in the chat, and we will have time for a few of those further down the line. But I just wanted to come back to this sort of this tripartite of aspects that you've talked about. So privacy, security, growth, and innovation, as being sort of key to implement successful implementation. I wonder whether, either looking at each of those in turn, or approaching the question differently, what you see as being the potential barriers to successful implementation.
Oh, this is such a good question. And in a lot of ways, the barriers are the barriers that have always existed to any kind of innovation. I've said to a lot of friends that we talk about digital government these days or data-driven governance. And in a way, that's no different from any kind of government, right? It's government that's now been put on into the digital sphere. And so the dysfunctions and barriers are the problems that we've always faced in any government. Mistrust, lack of transparency, which will lead to people then manifesting that in resistance to data sharing. So it's a new manifestation, but the fundamental problem is still the same. Siloed systems, right? Departments not willing to open up or coordinate with one another, systems that are not whole of government, not whole of society, not joined up as well as they could be, bureaucratic slowness and inertia, relying on rules to the point that we end up being slowed down by them rather than being enabled by them, and skills gaps, right? A shortage of digital talent in government, meaning that we don't have the literate users and commissioners of projects to actually undertake some of this work. Some of the early data sharing in Australia, for example, was quite limited because of really stymied cross-agency alignment, and as a result, a huge amount of citizen backlash. But I think, as I said, these are the traditional dysfunctions of government. They don't go away. They're made easier to deal with by the existence of technology. But the scope for catastrophic disaster is also greater because the technology can now scale, right, on in such a more pervasive way.
So, just thinking about the roles here in the creation of the infrastructure, we've talked a lot about the public sector, particularly, and the responsibilities of public servants in creating the infrastructure. We haven't talked a huge amount about the private sector.
Yeah.
And public-private partnerships are something that, were talked about a lot in history, but recently we've started to hear much more about that, particularly in the digital economy. So I wonder what you think the balance is between the responsibilities of the public sector and the private sector here.
Yeah. I'll broaden your question a bit, Emma, and say that this is about whole of society approaches to data. So the public and private sector are important, but we need citizen literacy, civil society, and NGOs to be part of this process of literacy building as well. Government, I think, has a fundamental duty to kind of set the broad rules here to ensure that there are fundamental principles of fairness, security, public interest, and a focus on generativity, as I mentioned earlier. Because if government doesn't do that, then the kind of overall tone of how data gets used doesn't get shaped. Private sector, I think, has a really important role in innovation, building the right tools, platforms, the analytic and the technical capacity to use the systems as well as possible. This is not to say that government has no duty to innovate too. Sometimes governments can push innovation, as we've seen in places like Estonia and Singapore, right? A lot of the banking innovations and moving into the digital banking sphere happened because the monetary authority, the central bank in Singapore, pushed our banks to do that, not because of some deep instinct for banks alone, because banks can be subject to silos of their own, right? Given that they are also large and complex systems. But by and large, I think government can set rules, private sector can innovate on the technology, especially. Civil society needs to constantly remind us that we need to be human-centered and take care of the human concerns around data security and data privacy. And then put together, these three sectors will need to co-create responsibility, right? So to collaborate where they can on use cases, to ensure that we're encouraging constant innovation in new use cases, not just kind of blind compliance, and bringing together these public, private, people sector collaborations in as embedded a way as possible. Canada's Digital Charter is a great example of this, right? They've embedded privacy and equity principles into the digital rules that they have, while at the same time ensuring some amount of role clarity amongst the different sectors.
Excellent. I suppose the thing that's missing for me in what you've just described, and you have mentioned it once, I think, in our conversation, is the I word, investment. Um,
Mhm.
so obviously, there's been a lot of economic modelling done here in the UK to extrapolate the potential value, um, particularly from implementing AI tools. But obviously, the AI tools are trained on data to a large extent. So I
Yep.
wonder what sort of level of investment you think is necessary? What should be the vehicle of that investment? Where should it come from? Do you, in the UK and in many countries, that there is a huge pressure on the public purse and lots of competing priorities. How do we make sure that the money gets directed to make all of this happen?
That's a really big question, Emma, and I'm not sure I have a complete answer to it, but I think we're also living out the answer at the moment in different policy systems. Because on the one hand, I do think, I talked about whole of society approaches earlier, right? I think where we find governments are not able to fund a lot of these investments on their own, there is a role that the private sector can play, and the role that the Indian private sector, for instance, played in creating the federated data architecture of Aadhaar, for example, and later on the UPI system. That's actually a very powerful example of what exactly the private sector can do, bringing in its investment plus innovation, right? So this is not just investment in a crude, quantitative way. It's bringing in the right techniques for what a country might need at a certain point in time. But that could not have worked well without the kinds of accountability mechanisms and the rules of the game that were being set by the Indian government. And I think we need to remember that there was that symbiosis between the public and private sector. So I think there can be a role for the private sector in this whole process. But ultimately, to be honest, where we ensure the kind of right accountability mechanisms on these different large-scale investments is to ensure, I think, that the technologies are as user-centered as possible. That they're not just there with a tech push, but that they're responding to a demand pull as well. And that, I think, is what helps us to know that ultimately we're meeting human needs here and not just investing in something that's going to become, a white elephant in a few years' time. Because that's one of the worst things you can have as far as legacy infrastructure goes, right? A system that was invested in and you're stuck with these stranded assets that cannot actually evolve. So it's not just investment that has to be there. You need the right amount of innovation and infrastructure to come in there. So it's a three I framework rather than just one I think.
Excellent, thank you. I've got a few questions. I'm going to look over there because the questions from the audience are up on the screen at the moment.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid it's another sort of business model funding question. But do you have a clear idea, asks one audience member, about the business and funding models for privacy enhancing technologies or their routes to scale?
I'd love to hear more about what this person means by this actually, because it's such a large question.
I guess it's
Yeah.
it's asking about, the drivers for
Mm,
implementation and again comes back to this idea. I mean, the public at large, it's very easy to make the case for investing in, well, it's easier to make the case for investing in housing or investing in education or school meals for children.
yeah.
Quite difficult to make that investment for funding privacy enhancing technologies, which actually ultimately those technologies can be the enablers,
Yeah.
those social good initiatives, but they're very upstream. So I wonder how you make that case, what those business cases, funding models might look like in light of that. And then because there is a worry that I can't remember what the phrase was you used exactly, but that we make a one-off investment, oh no, it hasn't worked, and it ends up being just a sad legacy system sitting
Yeah,
in a
that's right.
corner.
Stranded. I talked about stranded assets and
Yes.
stranded
Stranded
infrastructure.
assets,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's such a powerful question because I think fundamentally, to be honest, the core of this issue is not about the model itself, but about how we actually end up valuing, right, different data systems. Because as you pointed out, Emma, it's really easy to kind of forget that these are worthwhile investments, right? And that they might seem abstract at the beginning, but they actually have very important real life effects on how we live and how we go about acts of daily living. And so I think actually one of the most important aspects here is for both government and private sector to think in a very concrete way about what aspect of the acts of daily living are transformed in a particular use of data, right? And acts of daily living in the past would have included things like brushing your teeth, right? Having a shower, feeding yourself. But today, the acts of daily living are so much more mediated in the digital space. We identify ourselves digitally. We authenticate ourselves digitally. You need the assurance that this was not a bot version of me coming and giving these talks, right? And answering these questions. We need to communicate online. We learn online. And I teach in, this is the school that I teach in, and some of our teaching happens online, but a lot of it happens in person. But during the pandemic, for example, more of the acts of daily living were transferred into that digital space. And I think we need to realize that that is all then happening with very real consequences, right? There are savings that come in terms of convenience. There are efficiency gains that businesses can have, which we can quantify. There are real life effects of being able to transcend distance, right? There are foregone expenses on things like having to take flights, for instance, because we can transfer data so much more seamlessly and effortlessly than before. And I think those are the kinds of things we need to realize we need to do, right? We need to find proxies for acts that we weren't always able to value. And the things we were doing that were pollutive or negative in terms of the economic contributions, and we've now been able to stop doing, that we need to also quantify because that shows a kind of what economists would call a Pareto improvement, right? And if we can do all of those things, then I think the business case becomes a little bit clearer. What we then do with that business case is actually a tactical second order question, right? Businesses can then respond to what citizen needs might be or consumer needs might be. And they will find that that'll be a natural thing for them to do because the needs have already been articulated. But I think it boils down to what are these acts of daily living that are changing and how those changes actually result in new forms of either value being created or of disvalue, right, or negative value being avoided.
I love that. I mean, I'm very much reminded as you're speaking about the opening up of the Transport for London data, which happened a long
Mm,
time ago now, and a couple of attempts to evaluate, well, successful attempts actually, the value of that to the London economy, um, both in terms of creating new wealth through the innovations that took place using that data, but also the improvement to the acts of daily living as you're describing. So, quicker journeys to work, more productivity of workers, less traffic and pollution in the system. And I think it was Deloitte actually that did the economic analysis of that. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is we kind of need more of that, which maybe requires more investment in the evaluation and more
yep,
skills in economists to be able to conduct those evaluations. You're agreeing.
absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. The
Excellent.
thing, the core on the evaluation though, and John in the chat has had a couple of questions there, right? I think his question was the one on the scaling effects of PETs, and he makes the absolutely correct point that there's a very hard reality of getting the business case of what you described with that value proposition
Mm.
to venture capitalists or through the treasury And that's entirely true. And I do think one of the challenges here is that the metrics that we have for valuation, right? This brings us back to language. And John, I think you weren't here when I talked about the generative value of data and not just the static value that it can have. It is something that actually current systems are not well endowed to deal with. This is one of those classic change management challenges, right? Where we are on the diffusion of innovation curve. We are right at the early stages here of innovation and maybe at the beginning stages of early adoption. We haven't got to the early majority or the late majority, and we certainly aren't convincing the laggards. And part of the problem, I think, is that sometimes the folks who are sitting in very traditional VCs or parts of the treasury are digital laggards, right? They are trying to apply the analog rules of 20 or 10 years ago to a very, very different set of phenomena. And we need to take them through how exactly new forms of value need to get articulated. And this is where I think experimentation becomes really important. We will not convince the second half of the diffusion of innovation curve all so easily. We need to gather data for them, and that data needs to come from new experimental and innovative tests, where we don't say we're going to bring new data approaches out to entirely, to an entirety of a population, but we test it, right? We test it in local settings, we test it in specific agencies, we gather what that data can do, and then from that data, we get buy-in because people have seen concrete advantages, not just a theoretical advantage.
It's so interesting because this comes up time and time again in the conversations that I have with policymakers, this notion of pilot, test, iterate, take the learnings, take the use case, and then scale. Which is it, and it's gratifying to hear that being discussed as an approach.
Mm-hmm.
I've got another question on the screen, so again, sorry for my eye line going over there, but data management relies a lot on data infrastructure. How do you see the future of cross-disciplinary data infrastructure? They're hard to implement, manage, and often require large amounts of funds. We're back to the money question again. Oftentimes, it's difficult to collect the expertise in one university, institute, and I guess government department. Is there any way to better deal with these difficulties and this bottleneck? Wow, that's a big
It's
question.
a really big question, and thank you to Shuai Wang for that question. There's an old saying, not a saying, it's kind of a regularity that those of us who study technology have noticed. It's called Conway's Law. And what Melvin Conway, who was a programmer in the 1950s and 60s, describes here, he says that any technology or new innovation that gets adopted by a system, the adoption will happen in ways that mirror the existing communication structure of that entity, right? What this means is we adopt tech, and I include, the large swathes of data out there as a form of technological innovation. When we adopt these things, we are doing it in ways that reflect our prevailing organizational structures and cultures and all the habits of mind and predispositions that we bring to that process. So I think, Shuai, when you talk about the difficulty of cross-disciplinary movement, that isn't a data problem. That is a fundamental culture problem and an organizational structure problem. Because it means that we haven't got to a point where we cross-pollinate data as well as we could, right? And we haven't got to a point where we understand that sometimes good projects will need qualitative and quantitative data and a mix of both of those, right, to get to the most useful and prescient insights on a particular set of issues. So I think the difficulties here actually lie in culture building rather than assuming that the solution is at the technological or at the data level. Once we figure that out, the culture will change then the funding mechanisms of how projects get funded in academic settings. We will then start to see that actually being able to collaborate across multiple data types as well as methodological traditions brings value rather than brings untidiness. And from that, I think we get to a better set of outcomes. It's exactly the same problem in government agencies, right? People don't want to share their data because the fundamental culture that they might have come from is a need to know basis for sharing of data rather than a good to know basis of sharing data. And if that culture doesn't change, then no amount of enablement by data seamlessness or moving across data lakes is going to change anything. You can have 5 different national data libraries and it won't change that. the culture and the attitudes, I think, are what needs to change.
Excellent. I've got supplementary questions, but I don't want to leave the audience shortchanged, so I'm going to go on to the next one, which is how can federated data governance balance national coordination with local control without compromising trust or interoperability? And I think this is super important. I mean, there's a global picture here, but there's also, we've now got the devolution agenda here in the UK, renewed focus on the mayoral and strategic authorities and the nations across the UK as well. So it would just be like, what is that balance? Like, how much should data infrastructure be a local implementation project? And how do we get the connections right and the balance
Mm.
right between the national and the local?
Yeah. There's some wonderful work in the management literature by a chap called Barry Johnson, called Polarity Management, right? And it focuses really on the fact that many things in life, right? Do we have open or closed structures? Do we have active or contemplative lives? Do we be kind or firm in the management of teams? These can seem like dichotomies, but they're actually not, right? They're meant to be, there are polarities in that you're meant to do both, right? And they use the polarity literature, scholars often use the infinity sign, right? The kind of an eight on its side, and they say that you are meant to be fluidly moving between these different extremes rather than choosing one of them. And I think the idea of national versus local is one of those things. The idea is not to choose between them, right? Or even balance between them in a precarious way. The answer is to do both as much as possible. The national system is important for setting in place the right sets of rules to ensure that the overall architectural approach is one that is optimizing at the enterprise level, right? And not just enterprising in a suboptimal way for individual entities. Because local entities will probably want to share data only with themselves rather than allowing for multiple levels of sharing to happen. So the national coordination is important to ensure that there is some level of global rather than local level optimization. But what you need the local for is to ensure that there is the right amount of specificity, the right amount of targeting of that data to actual local needs. Sometimes if you're going to be sharing data on parking, for example, you may not need the national system to be aware of that, but you do need your local municipality to be aware of what parking data looks like and how traffic movements are evolving over a day or over a week or over a month, right? You want to see that local level granularity come up. So I think we need both of these to exist. The national providing that macro picture and the optimization at a global level, and the local providing the right amount of specificity and granularity. And this is why the word subsidiarity is so important, right? I don't just mean that in the European sense. I mean as a piece of vocabulary. Subsidiarity is important because it means that we're handling the policy at the right level to ensure that maximum optimality emerges from it. And I think we need, therefore, both national level coordination and local level specificity in order for data systems to be as healthy as possible.
I guess the next question is it's quite interesting in terms of a segue, because when we talk about global, national, and local, we're not just talking about the public sector, of course. We could also be talking about academia and
Mhm.
research. Um, and somebody's asked in the question, and this is Shui Wang from Maastricht University, what future features are most demanded in scholarly data infrastructure from what you see? Big topic.
Yeah, absolutely. This should be the subject of a whole different webinar, right? Because, on the one hand, the traditional differences that we see in scholarly data are between qualitative and quantitative. But actually, it's a much wider spectrum than that, right? I mean, there's many types of quantitative data. There's point and trend data. And even within the qualitative world, there's the stuff you get as an immediate impression. And then there's what you can also have in a more interpretive Clifford Geertzian sort of way, right? That's anthropologically rich and ethnographically rich, not just qualitatively surface level. And what I think is we really do need multimodal forms of data. Because what I see in the types of data that's out there is there's a tendency to focus on the bits of data that we're most comfortable with, right? Rather than recognizing that within the scholarly data infrastructure, there's actually multiple types and multiple forms of richness that we can draw on. And I think this links actually to the culture problem that I mentioned earlier, and the fact that, a lot of times scholars are not good at genuinely multidisciplinary work. Right? We do what I like to call plural monodisciplinary work, right? Each of us does our own thing, and it's plural because all of us are doing it, and then somebody somewhere joins the dots. That's better than nothing. But ideally, we would have multiple disciplines coming together, posing the right questions, and then using a data infrastructure that is cross-ranging across these different types in order to have much more complex and rich responses to the questions that we're actually trying to manage.
It's so interesting because there is a bit of a parallel in policy terms with, a kind of acknowledgement that if we continue to operate in silos, then we won't get the value, we won't get the richness,
Yeah,
the benefits as well, obviously,
totally. Yeah.
to society broadly.
And when you think about it, right, Emma, why the India system is so interesting, or why examples of public digital infrastructure I think a really interesting indication of the way forward is two things, right? One is by having a system of a national ID, a data layer, and a transactions layer, on top of which we then put multiple use cases. Two things happen. One is we help people to see that data needs to be shared, like as a matter of architecture and design, right? And that this not invented here syndrome of I got my data, you got your data, and never the twain shall meet, is actually going to be really sub-optimizing for our overall systems. That is an important instinct that needs to change because we don't have that as a natural course, right, amongst different agencies. But equally, with that kind of a DPI system, the use cases are all sitting on top of that federated architecture, right? And they are all using all three layers of ID, data, and transactions at the same time. And what that helps us to see is that each new use case does not need to reinvent the wheel. There's a tendency to end up doing that reinvention because everybody wants to control their own data, to control the security, to have cyber assurances that their system is going to be robust. But actually, what needs to happen is the fundamental infrastructure needs to be robust, precisely so that the different use cases don't have to do that reinvention of the wheel each time and start from scratch each time they are trying to tackle a new human need.
So important. There's a question that we've had that's been up in the chat, and apologies to whoever it was because I don't have a name on my screen who asked this. But applying the tragedy of the commons principle to my sharing of my data, that sharing may result in many benefits for society. So the questioner cites the TfL example, but individually for me, the individual, will result in a loss of privacy, which I may not be happy with. Therefore, I will not use or share my data as it does not benefit me personally, even when it might result in multiple benefits for society. Please discuss.
It's like an exam question, right?
It
Here's a
is,
statement
isn't
and discuss.
it? To what extent do you agree?
Yeah, exactly. Well, here's the extent to which I don't entirely agree with that statement because I think what needs to happen there is precisely the kind of clear legislation that we talked about when we began this conversation. It's not the case that we lose when our data gets shared. We only lose if the existing systems don't take care of that data. And that's why a stewardship mindset is critical so that the right legal systems and legal architectures and structures can be put in place so that I know that when that sharing happens, those ecosystem gains can accrue while at the same time, I don't have a compromise or an erosion of the personal value that that data can have to me. I think we can set up systems this way, and it takes work. It'll be hard going because this whole kind of system needs constant vigilance, right? One breach, and that's all you need to end up shattering the confidence in that system. So this is where we haven't talked much about this, but the cyber and security of these systems, the cyber and the digital security of these systems is really quite critical. And those systems need to have robust monitoring mechanisms for potential threats. There need to be speedy responses when threats are realized. And once a breach occurs, we need to be able to spot it, deal with it quickly, and reconstruct the system relatively fast. None of these things are easy to do, but if those things are there, plus the assurances of legal mechanisms that protect individual data, I think we'd all be much more likely to say, all right, you know what, on a risk management level, we are okay making these decisions about our data. We don't mind the sharing so that the ecosystem gains can be accrued, so that the benefits can be accrued to the commons, and we ensure that there aren't outlandishly large losses to the individual.
Thank you. I think you might have passed the exam. It came from Kevin, by the way, and Kevin says it is an exam question, or it was an exam question. So there you go. I think we've got time probably for one more. And I've got a question from Abner, and he or she says, quite curious if you see a trend of startups or enterprises having chief data officers and what roles those CDOs could play in these organizations.
It's a great question. And if this is Ibnor, my friend from Singapore, then hello. I know it's very late for you at the moment. Thank you very much for tuning in. And
Yeah,
if it isn't Ibnor, my Singapore, is
thank
it?
you so much.
Yeah. And if it isn't Ibnor, my friend from Singapore, then hello to my new friend, also called Ibnor. Either way, I love this question. Perfect. It is Ibnor from Singapore. So I think it's a really good question because I think the chief data officers are going to be a really interesting matrix entity in the leadership structure of an organization. They're going to have certain vertical roles, right? Where they are going to be responsible for data use and adoption. They will have to play a certain entrepreneurial role as well in saying to people, you need to use data a lot more because the instinct to use data is not a natural one, right? That comes to most systems. And then the instinct to share that data is even less natural. So they will have to play some of that role to kind of go against the grain of the organization and the natural tendencies and make sure that silos are actually surmounted as much as they can. But they will also have culture building roles. And these I think of as more horizontal roles, right? Roles about how the overall culture can get established. And in these spheres, I like to think that chief data officers can have roles that kind of boil down to three S words, right? They are sponsors of a broader culture of using data, and they're sponsors in the sense that they're guiding that process, bringing wisdom to it so that these are not reckless users of data. They're not users that end up with compromises of privacy or kind of reckless attempts that end up with creating a threat surface that is more susceptible to breaches. So the sponsorship and wisdom becomes important. They have to be data stewards as well, right? So the stewardship part comes in here again. They guide a project along, they guide the use of data, and they need to ensure that sometimes they will know how to slow down a data experiment if they think it's not going in line with the right sets of norms and rules. And then ultimately, they need to be shields as well. When something goes wrong, right, either because there is a breach or because there's a compromise in the system, or as human systems can sometimes experience, if someone gets angry, right, with a data team, the chief data officer should step in and protect that team. They need to provide shield and cover for this work to happen. And if all three of those roles get played, right, as horizontal culture building, right, sponsor, steward, and shield, while at the same time building up the expertise and the skills of the data function, then I think the overall matrix actually gets strengthened because the horizontal and vertical components will both have been enriched and developed. So thanks, Imran. That's a great question.
It
Emma,
was a
go back to you.
great question, and there you see every ODI webinar has to end on a reference to the Matrix. What would we be without it?
Well, this was a matrix rather than the matrix. So maybe yeah, but
I
yeah.
know. So I'm sorry, folks, we don't have time for any more questions. But Aaron, if you're willing, what we've done in the past, where there's more questions than we have time for, we ask you if you wouldn't mind to answer them electronically on an email, and then we'll post those out so that people can get answers to their questions. I do have
Right.
one more for you before we let you go, because
Okay.
I'm absolutely fascinated in where your research is going next, what you're actually working on.
Wow, another big question. So I'm thinking a lot about two things. One is, how can governments be better enablers and users of different aspects of tech and not just regulators? The regulatory role, I think a lot of us understand that government needs to play, even if it's hard to do. But what I think governments also need to realize is they become better regulators if they are also literate users and literate enablers of an overall system. And so I'm asking myself these questions in a few ways. One is, in terms of public digital infrastructure, how can governments be better users? What does DPI 2.0 look like, especially in a world of AI? And for both of those sorts of questions, as government becomes a literate user, how does it organize its ecosystem? Is it a very centralized system? Is there a role for central entities like chief data officers or chief data outfits and organizations? And how much of that role then needs to ramify into the horizontal space as well, so that different agencies which already exist are also able to take on these functions in a better way. So that question of ecosystem organization or institution building, I think is really important. It's a very classic public admin question, but it's what happens when public admin meets technology, I think, right? Because I think there are new structures that will be necessary. Because if all we do is transplant technology into the old structures, then that's another example of Conway's law, right? All we're doing is perpetuating the existing structures, mindsets, and architectures of the existing system, which means that the tech is only going to reinforce those existing systems rather than truly transform.
That's wonderful. And I think we have there our synopsis for our next webinar with you. So we
That
will
sounds
be
great.
asking that. Aaron, thank you so much. I think from the questions coming in and the comments, people are truly fascinated by what you've had to say today. So I'd love to say thank you very much, Aaron Maniam. It was great to have you along to the ODI webinar. We'll look forward to the next one. And thank you too, of course, to our audience who've been wonderful as always and put many thought-provoking questions to our special guests. So thank you all, and please do attend the next one. See you soon.
Thanks for having me, Emma. Much appreciated.
Bye.